I should start with a warning that I am still quite new to Vernon. I've only been with the art gallery for 8 months, so I'm still learning as we go, through like deep immersion in system, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So this is kind of a current state on where I'm up to in my Vernon journey, and where the art gallery is up to in our project, where we're reviewing our documentation policies, our collection management policies, and obviously our like cataloguing procedures that come into that as well. So my focus has been trying to develop a new cataloguing strategy, where we are focused on simple, flexible data entry so that we have simple, flexible data flow into other systems, into reporting that's really intuitive for other users. Because at the gallery, we do have a wide range of Vernon users of differing abilities. So the more straightforward our records are, the better for everybody. And we also have a recent or somewhat recent problem with the changing nature of art that I know a lot of my colleagues in the art industry will be feeling me on this, where we have a movement away from simple traditional paintings, drawings, one record, one object kind of cataloguing systems, to figuring out how are we going to manage these really complex artworks that are really sometimes really flexible in their display, or have lots and lots of parts or components that maybe need lots of different preservation strategies, or storage, or specialist installation requirements, and all of that. So we're trying to come up with a system that is intuitive for the whole range of works in our collection, whether that's simple to complex. So I thought I would start with an example of one of those complex works. This is by artist Brooke Andrew. The work is called What's Left Behind. And it was kind of the challenge that was brought to me as I first started, that this was the work that kind of broke our system. It cannot be catalogued in one record, which was our sort of standard go-to for works up to this point. This work, which you can see on the floor in the gallery, it consists of 9 different sculptural vitrines. So museum, like cabinet of curiosity type sculptures. There's TBA, time-based art components to it as well. There's replaceable elements. There's an archive of about 200 pieces that can go in the cabinets, or the cabinets could be empty, or they can be filled by another artist, or like the curatorial perspective on this is so broad and varied that managing this work, installing this work, documenting the display and the location of this work is really complex. So we needed to really use Vernon's group member and related record cataloguing for this. And that has been a challenge, in that we've traditionally focused on one work equals one record. And that kind of logic, which does work for the vast majority of our collection, is a little bit hard to break when you consider that this is one work, but we have to change our perspective on, what does that object record mean? It doesn't have to be one record. It's kind of a record network, or a complex system that matches the complexity of our art. The other problem that we've had a lot with our sort of traditional ways of cataloguing is often there's been a focus on the record with the physical item, or perhaps the visible item that you can see on display. And this work here is another good example that breaks that system. This is called Avatar Towers by Ramesh Mario Nithyanandran. Apologies for my terrible pronunciation. And this is another work that is really variable in terms of its display. So there are, I think, 68 sculptural avatar pieces. That is sort of the core of the work. And then the towers component is this sort of architectural, structural, growing pink piece in this iteration of the work that can change in every iteration. So sort of the concept of the tower is conceptual only. There doesn't have to be a physical representation in any particular way for this work. We have already at the gallery installed it in a wide range of different spaces and formats, and we are still storing those architectural formats, but they're not catalogued in system in any way connected with the artwork. So we have a problem there. We have a disconnect between what the sort of the media of the work is and the actual physical representation of that work. And we're finding the same problem with our time-based artworks as well. We haven't to date been tracking the digital files in system. And now we have a digital preservation system where the files are going to be in there, but it's not searchable, it's not browsable. Like that's not the aim of that system. And those works need to be recorded properly in the CMS so that they can integrate. So new challenges, but the focus for us then, like we've got on the board, all integral elements of the work, whether they're digital, whether they're physical, whether they're conceptual, whatever it happens to be, with these new art forms, they all need to be catalogued in system. So we're trying to come up with a system that works for all of those sorts of things. And we want that system to be complex, like the works, but not complicated. So the way we're trying to do that is through 5 simple steps, hopefully simple. 1, the summary of the artist's concept of the work, which we'll get to in a second. The identification and categorization of all the integral elements of the work. The identification of the sort of detail level components that constitute those elements. Understanding of the actuality of the physical or the digital actual thing, or the replaceability of those elements as well. And identifying all the related accessories that might be required to actually put the work on display. So if we start with our first point, summarising the concept of the work, again, that's kind of trying to understand what the actual work is that we have accessioned into the collection. And sometimes when those works are conceptual or variable, what we have actually acquired might be a concept or the IP rather than something that is sort of physical or perhaps handed over at the point of acquisition. The fields that we're using to document these sorts of summaries is the brief description field and group notes. So again, going back to the Brooke Andrew work, you can see, maybe you can't see, sorry for the small text. This is just a screen grab from our website, and the about information you have there, that's pulling straight from our brief description field. So we're currently using brief description as part of our acquisition process. So this is what goes through our acquisitions and loans committees and is approved by our trustees. It's a very curatorial, editorial kind of piece, and it also comes straight from the artist's conceptualization of the work, the artist's intent for the work, and it's a beautifully worded art speak kind of thing, which has its place, but it doesn't really tell you what it is in a way. I don't come from an art background generally, so when I was chatting with curators initially about this work, and I was saying, like, how, what if we lost the images, or what if we're in an emergency situation and we don't have access to the system, like what are our key sort of identifying components that we can go, oh, there's the work. And they were like, oh, but it's easy, it's here. And I was just like, but I don't get it. I don't speak the language yet. So that's why we're going to have group notes for the people, the logical people like me who need it kind of mapped out in a flowchart, because that's how my brain works. And that's also really handy in those sorts of emergency situations. And also when we can set up this sort of network of records where everything has its place and everything can link to, the equipments that are required for that, or perhaps the digital files that relate specifically to one component but not others. So it just kind of, we're using the group member system as quite literally a mind map of these complex works. So each integral element is a member object, and then in the notes field next to that, which is quite really handily situated so you can see the notes straight against the member objects, we have an explanation of the variability of the work, of the installation requirements and things like that. So I've already kind of explained a lot of the variable aspects of these works, but feel free to read this beautifully worded description of the variability of what's left behind. So step 2 is identifying the integral elements of the work. So integral element is, kind of a buzzword that we've pretty much just made up to be able to explain the hierarchy of the works. And how we might be able to organise these narrower records. So an integral element can be a physical thing, or it can be a group of things, or it can be a conceptual kind of categorisation. But the idea is that integral elements are integral to display. They have to go on display in every single iteration of the work. And that is applicable to works that are across the spectrum of simple to complex. So for instance, a single painting is one integral element. It's a painting. Whereas the Brooke Andrew work has 9 integral elements, each of those sculptural components. Does that make sense? Yes. And to identify the integral elements, we're using object type. We're using the member level of group cataloguing, and that keeps it nice and simple. So like I was saying, our integral elements can be in various types and categories. So we can have a single object, we can have an object that's made up of multiple parts, or we can have multiple objects that are similar, like the avatars in Avatar Towers. We can have an ephemeral or consumable element. We can have simple or complex time-based media. We can have mechanical or kinetic elements of display. And then these last two, the spatial and design concepts, or the display environment, that's something that is speaking again to that point I made earlier about everything associated with the installation of the work should be catalogued in system rather than relying on install guides or correspondence with the artist and things like that. So if there are particular requirements about scale of space, or lighting in the space, or particular furniture that has to be in the space, wall designs, things like that, that can all sort of be grouped as parts of this display environment. And then that serves as like a general flag, signposting the complexity of that installation. Same with the technical environment. So that's for works where we have a lot of equipment or other TBA associated things that need to be included for the display, but aren't necessarily included in the medium description or the artist kind of concept of the work. But that way we can organise all of the related accessories under one thing that makes sense. So we're using object type. And these are the object types that we have across all levels of the hierarchy. So for integral elements, you've pretty much got all of those except for multi-element. That only applies to the top tier work record. And variable at the bottom only applies to the next level down, because our integral elements can't be variable. They are integral to display. So then we can sort of structure our work, like I was saying before, in kind of a flow chart of how the components of the work and the elements of the work make up the one completed work. So we're using the group type and level of current object field. So at the top, we have the work. And again, that's acknowledging that all of these records make one work in our object record system. And then within that, you can have the integral element levels, or you can go straight to component level. If there is, say, one integral element, you wouldn't create a second record that's essentially duplicating the same information. For a lot of people at the gallery, this has been the biggest challenge so far that I've had to try to understand in my own mind and then also communicate to other people is, when do we use the object part table and when do we create this group level hierarchy? And the thing is, with the flexibility of Vernon, you can do either, but we need a rule that is consistent across the board. Previously, we were sort of saying if it's alphabetical parts A to Z, so 26 components of the work, we'll put that in the table, but anything beyond that gets a group member hierarchy. And having such a nominal number-based system just doesn't make sense. So we're really just trying to focus on simplicity of the record. So if you have uniform information, regardless of the number of parts or components or whatever you want to call it, if you can have one entry in a field, then it can be one record. If you have different information and you're creating a lot of values in those multi-value fields, then you might consider doing the group member so that we can have really simple basic records, even if they're joined together. And that supports the flexible data flow in and out of the system, like I was talking about before. If we think about those multi-part fields, and that's where we've got location, production, media category, which is our label for classification, medium description, and the dimensions fields. If we can think of all of those as a column in the table of the database, and each record is a row, that's literally the structure of a database. It's the columns that make records complicated, not the rows. So better to have more records with smaller data than to have one record with big, complicated data sets. And because I love flowcharts so much, here's one more to help decide whether it's a part or a component. So the first question to ask is there variability in display? Does this particular component have to go on display in every iteration of the work? So if it does have to, then so if there is no variability, it has to go on display, then you can go to the next question. If not, it's a component. Thinking about location management, are each of the parts stored together? Would you have one value in your location field? If not, then they're components. If yes, the next question, are they uniform? Are we doing multiple values in those production fields or dimensions fields or classification or media category fields? If they are uniform, they can be a part. That's nice and easy. If not, again, differences in values. We're trying to avoid so many multi-valued records to keep the record simple, so we have parts or components there. Everybody loves a good flowchart. Some more examples from the collection. On the left, we have a triptych by Sally Robinson. This is recorded just as one record at work level. It's stored together. The dimensions of each panel are similar. The medium description is similar. The production is similar. Obviously, it's the one triptych. So one record works perfectly in this instance. The one on the right by Dick Watkins, it's much larger and it's been separated for storage. So each of the panels is stored in a different location. So that record information is not uniform. So we would have a record for the left panel, a record for the right panel, and we're grouping them together. If we look at the level of those as well, we can have component levels for the Dick Watkins rather than having an integral element record in the middle, because that would serve the same purpose as that top tier work record. This is another iteration of the avatar towers that we saw at the start with the pink sort of scaffolding tower. So when we're looking at the integral elements that make up this work, we've got the group work that is multi-element. So there's multiple integral elements to consider. The first element is the ceramic and bronze figures in some amount. We could have 1, we could have 68, or anything in between. The next level is the architectural structure, which is completely variable. So in this iteration, we've got the sort of timber tower with the timber platforms. In the other iteration, we saw the pink scaffolding. And in each time, that is a multi-part record, because that's always sort of created and stored together. The materials are similar. And when we think about the representative aspects of this work a little bit later, we want to keep those individual records as simple as possible. And then the last integral element of this work is the sentient mound, named by the artist, which is the clay avatar that you can kind of see right at the top there, which is like the central focus of the work and has to be on display each time. So all of the other avatars are variable except for the sentient mound. Another example of the types of integral elements is this massive work, Chinese Bible, which consists of 3,000 notebooks, found notebooks and diaries. And again, those notebooks can be displayed in varying amounts. So you can display all 3,000, you could display any other number less than that, as long as there is a mixture of sizes and colours. So that, as a concept, is one integral element. And then there is a video, a digital video that goes with the work as well. So that is a second integral element. If you look at the numbering, the washing video was actually acquired later, but it has always been on display with the work. And it's the intent of the artist that it always should be on display with the work. So then once we understand what the integral elements are for display, we move on to that detail level component, and that generally forms the next member object down from integral element. And they can fall into the same categories as the integral element. When we looked at group type before, that was consistent across, but they can also be variable. So again, we're looking at the group type and the level and the object type, just like with integral elements. Just to go straight into an example of a component, this is a work by Lindy Lee called Birth and Death, and they are a series of accordion-style photographic prints. Again, can be displayed variably. So the only integral element of this work is some variation of the accordions displayed on the ground. It can be one accordion, it can be 114 or anywhere in between. So we've skipped the integral element level of the hierarchy. It goes straight from work level to component level, and each of the components are listed underneath that work. And that way the location management is really easy every time you need to move one on or off display. So you can see they don't all fit on the screen, but there's all the records attached there. And in their group type, they also have the flag that they're variable. So when our curators are looking at what needs to go on display for this, they can make a choice of which component to display. This is another example that isn't variable. So Caroline Rothwell's Topography 2, that consists of 3 integral elements that each have components that comprise that element. So the first is this cloud-like sculpture. Then we have this botanical sculpture that has 20 or so smaller parts that are fused together to make that. Stored variably as well. And we have the topographic plinth system that kind of interconnects on the bottom. And even though it's a plinth, it's still an integral component of the work. So you can see in system how we've divided the hierarchy up. So each component has an integral element level, and the ones that, each integral element has a level, and the ones that are multi-component have the components coming off of that. And this is an example of a brief description of one of those integral element levels. This is C2, the botanical sculpture, where you can kind of draw together how those subcomponents are being installed together. So it allows you to provide greater clarity on kind of like an instruction manual on how each individual component builds to the whole work. So we're looking specifically at these 6 individual components. Then we have the question of what is the actual physical or digital thing that we're tracking, and how replaceable is that thing. We're looking at having one thing in one place, or for digital works, one thing in one space. But again, coming back to that idea of simplicity and flexibility, one thing being the key that we're recording in each record. So we're looking at object status to determine that, collection, object type, and location, and the related objects that represent those representation collections. So the work record, like we do for the vast majority of things in the collection, the work record is the hub of the actual work that is on display, and also the hub of the collection management activities that are recorded in the CMS. So the work is going to be attached to loan forms. The work is going to be attached to the acquisition proposal, to deaccessions, pretty much every activity except for movement, where you actually need the physical thing. The work record is the only one in the group hierarchy that has the status of collection. So the collection status is collection. Valuation information in the work record and not in the components that make up the work. And the narrower records that come from the work, whether they are integral elements, components, subcomponents, whichever level of detail we go down, they have the collection sub-collection. And that way we can filter those out in reporting if we need to. So for valuation or our acquisition and annual reporting, we need to report on the number of works in the collection. So then we're not inflating those numbers. And all of the works in the group member hierarchy are accessioned. So if the work is a single thing, a painting, a drawing, whatever it happens to be, and there is only one record, it's accessioned collection, which is what we have been doing forever. Or if it's one of the group member networks, then each element is also accessioned with sub-collection, and the component records or anything further on also accessioned and sub-collection. So even if we have sort of sub-component records, we're not doing sub-collection or anything like that. It's just that one term to filter. Then we're introducing a new concept of a representation collection. So that is to factor in works like we talked about with the avatar towers and that architectural component. Some works have representative elements that are replaceable or might have several different digital versions that can represent the work in a particular iteration or for a particular amount of time, but is not considered to be part of the work in perpetuity. So this is basically to account for works that are expected to have a shorter lifespan or are expected to change with each iteration. We're not then having to go through the process of deaccessioning every iteration of that work. Often these objects are acquired by the gallery from the artist at the point of acquisition, or they are created afterwards in accordance with the artist's intent. and they are still part of the secondary collection of the gallery, but they are not formally accessioned into the core collection. So we have our digital representation collection and we have a physical representation collection, and that sits at that collection level in the collection field. And then off that, we have, these are our group types for that collection. So for digital, whether it's a temporary file or the preservation sort of parent record, and all our preservation files go under that. When we're talking about physical representation, we have a hierarchy, which then feeds into retention strategies. So if that physical representation is made by the artist, that gets a higher sort of status. We might have physical representations that are nominated for display. So if there are multiple representations, the nominated one is what you would choose for display in that instance. And we can have spare parts as well. Here is an example of object type. So again, going back to that avatar towers, because it is a really clear example of a representation of the architectural structure. You can see the different iterations that we've had. So we've looked at the pink scaffolding, we've looked at that timber tower structure, and we've also displayed it on sort of individual timber plinth-like towers. Each of these components are now in system as representation collection. So it allows us to track individually the components of the work, and they are related to the architectural structure component record. They have the object status acquired, but not accessioned. For instance, this flowchart. Managing location then is something we have to consider when our goal is sort of one thing, one place. So we can't have the accessioned collection architectural structure, for instance, in one place and the representation of that in the same place. Then we're duplicating location. So some records in our group cataloging system are conceptual only. The actual location, as you can see in the Caroline Rothwell example, is NA concept only. It's not applicable. And part of the training and rolling out this system is communicating to everyone who is involved in location movements that you can't physically move a concept. So we're disallowing movement on those records. We don't need to add them to our movement forms. We don't need our logistics team to try to find this concept and put it somewhere. So it's purely conceptual, and it's kind of a placeholder record for the rest of the hierarchy that has the actual location information. We're also doing concept-only records in the narrower records of bound or inseparable works. For example, albums, portfolios, books, things like that, where we might put a book on display open at a particular page, and then we can have each page as a concept-only sub-record to monitor lux levels and display history and things like that. But we're not duplicating that page on location and inside the book that is also located to the gallery space. Concept-only records will also be those replaceable items. So for example, again, with the avatar towers, the architectural structure will be concept-only, that is the accessioned collection work, and then the representation of that will have a physical location. We're also giving concept-only locations to the display or technical environment integral element records, because they really are just signposting the need for equipment or particular design of the space that is not something that is locatable. So when these concept-only works do go on display, they get another sort of conceptual location that is installed. So we can still track that the work is on display, but we're not duplicating actual location information. So as a sort of conceptual example, we can apply this as well to records that are ephemeral or time-based or digitally born. So You can see the work record is concept only. When it is on display, it moves to installed, but otherwise the movement is disallowed. So our collection systems team does those movements rather than our logistics and collection registrars. If we have a digitally born component, whatever that happens to be, that location is created for display, but we are giving that created for display an actual movable location status. So it can then be moved to whichever gallery space in the art gallery or offsite if it goes on loan. The actual location is managed in those records. Any digital files that are attached to that, the temporary created for display exhibition copy goes between created and then onto our digital storage space. But the preservation copies are not moved at all. They stay the same. Similar if we had an ephemeral element, for example, we have works that are just balloons, or we have works that are spices in a stocking. So those sorts of things are created for display and then destroyed after that iteration. So the usual location is created, the current location when on display is wherever it happens to be in the gallery. So at any point in this sort of branch, we're not duplicating locations. And then we have to identify the related accessories, which are not actual components of the work, but might be required for install, usually with installations or time-based art media, if there's computers or speakers or whatever other technical equipment that is required. We are defining those by object status, collection, object type, and related object, just like we were doing with the representation collection. And in our accession numbering, we're also trying to identify those in the relationship that they have with the work. So accessories have the object status acquired, they're still gallery assets, and the collection status accessory. They don't have a group level as they're related to the work, like the representation collection. There are particular types of accessory, and we have those clearly defined so that they match a retention or disposal strategy as well. So accessory here is the collection level, and these are the object type levels. For example, object type. Just to chat about another example that kind of brings all of these concepts together, Lineament by Hiraki Sawa is, it's quite an exceptional work about memory and sort of the unwinding and rewinding of time. So this work is dual channel video. It has to be displayed on perpendicular walls so that you have the two channel videos side by side. There has to be a particular scale of the space so that you can sort of step back and view the video from perspective. And it also has a record player, a particular artist modified record that goes on the player, and very specialized technical equipment and software that runs the record forward and then back. So it's time moving forward and then time moving backwards. So this was what that record looked like previously. Again, I'm sorry if it's too small for you to see, but take my word for it, even if you could see it, you would want to unsee it because I just can't, I can't take this in and understand what is going on. So it was one work record with 38 accessories attached, and I could not tell you which accessory was actually required to go on display at any one time. So we've tried to simplify that in our group member system. So we are classifying this work as having 5 integral components. The first is the complex TBA component, the dual channel digital video, color, sound, and software. Then we have the record player, which has other equipment attached to it. We have the record that goes on the record player. We have the technical environment that covers all of the requirements of playing that software. And we have a display environment that takes into account the space, the perpendicular walls, the seating, and things like that. And this also comes with a nice certificate of authenticity and in an artist edition box that needs to go with the work if it was ever transferred to a different institution. So if we break it down, the digital video level, you can see clearly the media carrier that came with that, the temporary exhibition file that is required, and then the preservation master files. And because that links all to the one component, it's very clear how that sort of fits together. Then if we're looking at the record player level, you can see the actual equipment that is required. I'm not sure if you can see with the font size, but we're pulling together a term required for display in the one-line summary of each object, so that if there are spares or whatnot, you can see this is the one that I need in each iteration. And this gives you an example of how that looks in terms of the cataloguing. So you can see it's accessioned collection for the work record. If you look at the group member screen, we have the 5 components there as member objects. And in the group notes, we're explaining how those components have to come together in each display. And you can see the core related objects as well there. And it's a concept only location. This is an example of one of the digital representation records, the temporary file that is created for display. If you look at the accession numbering, we're using a prefix of digirep so that you can tell the difference between whether it's an accessory or it's the actual required representation or the particular type of accessory that it is. It has the location created for display, and we're using the general flag field for that required for display note that comes into the one-line summary. This is our preservation digital representation. With this one, when we're doing the accession numbering, we're pulling from other ID because preservation files or the parent record of these sorts of things might have multiple related objects. So then you can sort of highlight which is the primary relationship. And we can pull that in. So it kind of gives you a long accession number where you can see it's a digital representation. This is the unique identifier, and then the record that is the accession number of the record that it relates to. And examples of our accessory collection as well. So one has the registration prefix equip for equipment. One has the physical representation, so the actual LP record or the record player that needs to go on display. And in the one-line summary, again, we've got required for display. We're pulling in the group type, so you can see the relationship between the accessory and the actual record, and whether it is concept only or a physical location that needs to be moved. So hopefully you can see how we can, in 5 simple steps, summarize these work records using just a handful of fields.